His mail-order bride got off at the wrong ranch and refused to leave. The trunk was the first thing I noticed. Not her, the trunk. It was sitting in the middle of my yard like it had always been there. This dark leather thing with brass fittings gone green. One corner wrapped in a strip of rawhide where the hinge had given out, and somebody had fixed it rather than quit on it. I was coming up from the lower pasture with a busted fence post over my shoulder and 24 things on my mind that weren't any of them good, and I stopped at the gate and looked at that trunk and thought, that is not mine. Then I looked up and saw her. She was standing on my porch, not sitting, standing, back straight. Both hands holding a piece of paper she'd folded into a square, and she was reading it, or reading something off the side of my barn. I couldn't tell which. The afternoon light was doing something particular to the dust in the air between us. She had dark hair and she'd pinned most of it up, but the ride had pulled some of it loose and it lay across her collar, and she didn't seem to notice or didn't care. I set the fence post down against the gatepost and walked up. She heard me coming. She turned before I got to the porch steps, and she looked at me the way a woman looks at a thing she's trying to figure out, steady, not unkind. Not what I'd call warm either, just level, like she was reading fence lines on a map. "Are you Caleb Dunmore?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. More like she was setting a post herself, finding out if the ground was solid. I said no. I told her my name, Harlan Cade. I told her Dunmore's place was the Double D, 4 miles east. You could see his windmill from the ridge. She looked at the paper in her hands. She looked at me. She looked back at the paper. "The driver said this was the Dunmore property," she said. Driver was wrong. She was quiet a moment. The wind came through and moved the loose hair across her face, and she put it back with 2 fingers without looking away from me. "How wrong?" she said. 4 miles. She nodded slow, the way a person nods when they're doing arithmetic behind their eyes and not yet done. Then she looked past me toward the road, which was empty. The wagon that had brought her was long gone. I hadn't even heard it come or go, which told me I'd been down in the lower pasture longer than I thought. "The next stage," she said. "Day after tomorrow, town 7 miles. She folded the paper again, smaller this time, and put it in her coat pocket. She had a dark wool coat, good quality once, the kind a woman buys to last and does last, worn at the cuffs. "Then I'll need somewhere to sleep tonight," she said. I should say here, because you might be wondering, that I am not a man who takes in strays. I was 53 years old at that point in my life, and I had been running this ranch alone for 11 years, and I had made my peace with it. 11 years since Margaret. 11 years of mornings that were just mornings, evenings that were just evenings, and the work in between, which was never finished and which I had come to regard as a kind of company. The work was always there. You could count on it. I did not make a habit of taking in strays. But I looked at this woman on my porch with her green hinged trunk and her folded paper and her wool coat worn at the cuffs, and something in me that had been still for a long time shifted. Not moved, not lurched or warmed, just shifted. The way frozen ground shifts when the temperature climbs 1 degree. You don't see it happen. You just notice the ground is different than it was. "There's a spare room," I said. "It's not much." "I don't need much." Her name was Nora Vass. She told me that while I was carrying her trunk inside, and I noticed she didn't offer to let me carry it. She just stepped aside and held the door and waited for me to decide if I was a man who'd carry a woman's trunk or not. I was. It was heavier than it looked. She'd come from Ohio. Not from a farm, she said, from a town. She'd been a schoolteacher for 6 years. The man she'd written to, Dunmore, she'd answered his advertisement in the autumn. She said all of this plainly, no embarrassment, the way a person states the terms of a business arrangement. She didn't say what had made a schoolteacher in Ohio write to a rancher in New Mexico territory. I didn't ask. I showed her the spare room, which had been a spare room for so long I'd stopped seeing it as anything. A bed, a washstand, a window looking east. She stood in the doorway and looked at it and said, "This is fine," and that was that. I made coffee and heated up what was left of the morning's biscuits, and she sat at my table and ate without ceremony, one elbow on the table, reading the paper she'd pulled back out of her pocket, Dunmore's letter, I supposed, and I sat across from her with my coffee and watched her in the way you watch something you don't know what to make of. After a while, she put the letter down and looked at me. "You've been alone here a long time," she said. It wasn't unkind. It was just the same level look, reading the fence lines. 11 years, I said. She nodded. She picked up her coffee. She said, "The biscuits are good." And that, I know how this sounds, that got me. Not the other thing, not the seeing me clearly, not any of it. The biscuits are good. Said plain, said honest, said the way you say something when you mean it and you don't need it to mean more than it means. 11 years I'd been eating my own biscuits alone. I knew they were decent. I'd never been told. I slept badly that night. Not unhappy badly. Just the air in the house was different and I kept noticing it. In the morning she was up before me. I came into the kitchen and she had the stove going and the coffee on, and she was standing at the window in the gray early light looking out at the yard, her hair down, just watching the ranch wake up. She heard me and turned and said good morning in the same plain way she said everything, and poured me a cup. I asked her if she'd slept. "Well enough," she said. "Your roof makes a sound." I said I knew. I'd been meaning to look at it. "Northwest corner," she said. "Loose tin." I looked at her. "I heard it in the night," she said. "Wind came up around 2. That was the other thing I should tell you about Nora Vass. She paid attention, not in a watchful, nervous way. She just noticed things. The way a person notices things when they've spent a long time in the world having to figure out what was going on without being told. She asked if she could be useful while she waited for the stage, and I said the garden needed seeing to if she had a mind to, and she nodded and went out, and I watched from the barn while she walked the rows, crouching here and there, pulling up what needed pulling, turning soil with a stick she'd found. She worked without fuss. She didn't make a production of it. Mid-morning I came up to the house for water, and she was in the garden still, on her knees in the dirt in that good wool coat, and she'd pushed the sleeves up, and her hands were dark with soil. I said, "You're going to ruin that coat." She looked at her arms. She looked at the coat. She said it needed doing. I filled my canteen and went back to work. That afternoon a rider came up the road, and I knew him, Pete Garfield. Worked for the 3 Rivers spread 10 miles north, ran messages and errands for Wickham, who owned it. He pulled up at my gate and called out, and I came over, and he looked past me toward the house and then back at me with an expression I did not particularly care for. "Heard you had a woman drop in," he said. "News travels. In that country it always did." "Passenger got the wrong property," I said. "She'll be on the stage day after tomorrow." "Dunmore knows," Pete said. He said it like he was being careful. "He rode to town this morning to sort it out." "She'll be on the stage," I said again. "Nothing to sort." Pete nodded slowly. In that way men nod when they think there's something you don't know. He said Dunmore was pretty sore about it. Said something about his investment. I looked at him until he stopped talking, and then I said I'd let Miss Vass know that Dunmore was aware of the situation, and he could ride back and tell Wickham and whoever else was paying attention that there was nothing here to pay attention to. He left. I went inside and found Nora at the table with a needle and thread, mending a tear in her coat that I hadn't noticed. I told her what Pete had said. I told her plain that Dunmore knew where she was and that he'd gone to town about it. She didn't look up from her sewing. "What kind of man," she said, "calls a woman his investment?" I didn't have an answer for that. She bit the thread and smoothed the mend with her thumb. "What kind of man is he?" "You know him." I said I knew of him. I said he had a big spread and a temper, and that he'd gone through 2 hired hands in the last year over disagreements. I'd heard different versions of. She was quiet a moment, looking at the coat in her hands. I wrote to him for 6 months, she said. Letters back and forth. He wrote well, carefully. She set the coat on the table. But carefully is a thing you can do for 6 months if you want something badly enough. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. How long do you have to know a person, she said, before you stop being a letter and start being a person to them? I said I didn't know. I said I figured it was different for everyone. She looked at me then, that level look. I don't think he would have been kind, she said. Not with anger, just with the particular certainty of a woman who has paid attention her whole life and has learned to trust what she sees. I said no, I don't think he would have. She nodded once. She folded the coat over the back of the chair and stood up and said, "What needs doing this afternoon?" I'm going to tell you what the 2 days before that stage felt like, and then I'm going to tell you what happened at the stage, and then I'm going to tell you the rest. The 2 days felt like something I had stopped believing in. It wasn't anything big. That's the thing about it. She didn't make speeches. She didn't look at me with meaning in her eyes or say the right things at the right moments. She just lived in the house the same way I did, matter-of-factly, with her sleeves pushed up and her attention on what was in front of her. She fixed the loose tin on the northwest corner of the roof the morning of the second day. I came outside and she was up there with a hammer and 2 nails she'd found in the barn, flat on her stomach along the ridge, and I stood in the yard looking up at her, and I didn't say a word because what do you say? She came down with dirt on her front and said, "That'll hold through the winter if you re-nail the rest of that row in the spring." I said I would. She looked at the yard. She looked at the barn. She looked at the east fence and the low field beyond it and the ridge beyond that, which was going purple in the morning light. "It's a good piece of land," she said. "It is," I said. We stood there a moment. "You've kept it well," she said, "alone." That's all she said. But the way she said it, not impressed, not pitying, just seeing it for what it was, the 11 years of it, the mornings and the evenings and the work in between, something happened in my chest that I am not going to try to describe to you because I don't have the words for it. That afternoon she sat on the porch and wrote a letter. I didn't ask to who. In the evening I made supper and she helped without being asked, and we ate and talked about her school in Ohio, about a winter I'd had some years back when the creek froze solid for 6 weeks and I'd lost 15 head, about things that mattered and things that didn't. She asked good questions, not polite questions, real ones, like she wanted to know the actual answer. I slept better that night. And I woke up the morning of the stage day, and I lay in my bunk for a long time looking at the ceiling, and I did something I hadn't done in 11 years. I thought about what it would be like if she didn't go. I thought about it until it hurt, and then I got up and made coffee. She was packed before breakfast. The trunk was back in the yard, same spot it had started in, brass fittings green in the early light. She came to the table with her hair pinned up and her coat on and ate without ceremony the same as she'd arrived. I hitched the wagon without being asked. She helped me load the trunk. We didn't talk much on the ride to town. The road was dry and the sage was silver in the morning, and the sky had gone that particular shade of blue that you only get in that country in October, deep and cold and very far away. She sat beside me with her hands in her coat pockets and watched the land go by. Partway there she said, "You're a quiet man." I said I guessed I was. She said, "I don't mind quiet." We got to town. The stage depot was the usual, a few men standing around, a wagon being loaded on the other side of the street, Dust, and Dunmore. He was standing by the depot door. Big man, red-faced, the kind of man who takes up more space than he needs to. He saw us come in and he walked over and I pulled the wagon up and he was already talking before I'd set the brake. Talking to her, not to me. Something about the misunderstanding. Something about the arrangements he'd made, calling her Miss Vass in a tone that put a line under it, as if the name were a claim. She got down from the wagon on her own side. She straightened her coat. She looked at him. She said, "Mr. Dunmore, I'm sorry to have caused confusion." He said something about the time and the expense, and she let him finish. She said, "I appreciate you coming, but I won't be continuing to your ranch." Quiet from him, a different kind of quiet than the kind I practiced. He said, "You have a contract." She said, "I have letters." A contract requires that both parties are as represented. He looked at me then, red-faced, getting redder. I got down from the wagon and stood by it. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I needed to say. He said some things then, loud enough that the men by the depot turned to look, called her foolish, called her worse, and I put my hand on the wagon rail and felt the wood under my palm and kept very still. She didn't move. She didn't look away from him. She said very quietly, "That's enough." And the thing was, in the way she said it, it was. The loudness went out of him the way air goes out of something punctured. He stood there a moment more, jaw working, and then he turned and walked off down the street, and the men by the depot found other things to look at. She turned to me. I was looking at her. I don't know what I had on my face. Whatever it was, she saw it. She said, "I wrote a letter last night." I said I'd noticed. "I wrote to the bureau in Santa Fe that placed the advertisement," she said. "I told them I'd arrived safely and had found a situation." I was still. The October light was hard and white around us. A dog was barking somewhere down the street. She said, "If the offer is open." And there it is. That's the whole of it, the thing I've been working around since I started talking. 53 years old and done expecting anything good, and a woman with her own will and her own clear eyes looked at me and said, "If the offer is open." I said I didn't make an offer. She said, "No, I know." She held my eyes. "I'm making one." We rode back in the same quiet, different quiet than the one going in. The sage and the blue sky and the ridge were the same. She was the same, hands in her pockets, watching the land. But somewhere around the halfway mark, she took her hand out of her pocket and set it on the seat between us, and I looked down at it. And then I took my hand off the reins for a moment and put it over hers. She didn't look at me. I didn't look at her. We just rode. The ranch came up over the rise the way it always did, the barn first, then the house, then the yard, and the trunk was not in the yard anymore because we had it in the wagon. The porch was empty. The loose tin on the northwest corner was fixed. I pulled up at the gate and she waited for me to come around and help her down, which was the first time she'd waited for me to do anything. I helped her down and she stood in the yard a moment, looking at the place. I unloaded the trunk. I carried it back inside. She held the door. It was heavier going in than it had been going out. I noticed that. Maybe it was only that I was tired from the drive. I set it in the spare room, which I was already thinking about differently, not as a spare room, as hers. And when I straightened up, she was in the doorway with that level look. "You'll want your own room," I said, "for now, for as long as you want." She nodded. She said, "Thank you, Harlan." It was the first time she'd used my name. I went back outside and unhitched the wagon and put the team away, and I stood in the barn for a long time in the smell of hay and horses, and I let what had happened settle through me the way water settles through dry ground. Slow, thorough. When I came back in, she had supper started, and a fire, and the lamps lit, and the kitchen smelled the way a kitchen is supposed to smell when there is more than one person in the house. I washed up at the basin. I sat down. She set a plate in front of me and sat across from me, and we ate. Outside, the wind came up. The northwest corner of the roof was quiet. I looked at her across the table, at the lamplight on her face, and the loose strand of dark hair, and the way she cut her meat without looking down at her plate, like a woman used to eating while keeping her attention on the room. And something I can only call gratitude moved through me so quietly I almost didn't feel it. Not gratitude to her, though there was that. Something larger. Gratitude that I had gotten up every morning for 11 years and done the work and kept the land and not fallen apart because the keeping of it had been worth it. Because here, at 53, a good woman had looked at what I'd built alone and said, "It's a good piece of land. You've kept it well." She looked up from her plate and caught me looking. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing." Then I said, "I'm glad you got off at the wrong ranch." She looked at me a moment with those steady, reading eyes. "Wrong is a strong word," she said. And she went back to eating, and I did too, and the fire went on and the wind went on outside, and the lamp made a small, warm circle of the table and the two of us in it. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world, which was exactly what made it everything.